Let's start the show. You already know who it is. My name is Mike Kyle, aka the Fantasy Vulture. I have over a decade worth of fantasy football experience, and I've continuously competed for fantasy championships over the course of the past 6 seasons. But enough of me, I'm here for you. On today's episode of the Fantasy Vulture, we're going to be taking a look at a brand new series called Fantasy for Beginners. Now, there are some people, believe it or not, who are just getting into fantasy football, and to that I say welcome to the great game that this is. It's super fun, super exciting, and super competitive if you play it the right way. But more importantly, this game can be very, very detailed and a little bit complex, so I'm really just going to break things down to the most simple way possible. We're going to keep things basic, because I don't want to scare you guys off. I want as many people to play this game as possible, because then, let's be honest, I get more people to watch my videos, and that's what we ultimately want. Anyway, though, so whether you are a significant other, a friend, or a family member who just wants to support someone in your life that plays fantasy football, maybe you want to get a better understanding of what actually goes into this game, this series is for you. I know specifically for me, I've had some friends reach out and be like, hey, I really want to support what you're doing over at Fantasy Vulture, but I'm not into fantasy football, and so this series is also designed for them as well to get a better understanding of what I'm doing here. But let's just jump into it. This video is going to be a little bit different, more so just me talking. We're only going to have a few graphics here, so if you want to tab out and you just want to listen to this more so as a podcast, if you're watching the video, be sure to do that. But you can also subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, preferably though Apple Podcast and Spotify. Those are the 2 platforms that I'm pushing. Just search Fantasy Vulture there. You guys saw on the intro. Follow me on all social media platforms at FF Vulture. We're just getting into the TikTok game there as well. And lastly, be sure to shoot me a text, 330-302-1554. That's going to be my space for pretty much any and all fantasy advice this season. I'm really trying to push that. And before we get started, lastly, I know we're going to jump into this in just a moment. Just be patient. But before we get started, though, be sure to smash that subscribe button, power running back style so you never miss a video, and also hit that like button like an open receiver downfield to show your support for the video and for the channel. Now, without further ado, let's jump into it. So I really just have 3.5 points for this video, and this is a very simple video just to kick off the series, and this is what is fantasy football? Because some people honestly don't know, or they don't have a firm understanding of what we actually do. So that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to explain a little bit. So let's start off with just the basic overview. We're going to break this down into the overview, how it works, and then scoring, even though we're going to have an entirely different video, a more in-depth video about scoring at a later date. And lastly, probably just some final thoughts if I have anything or if I feel like I left something out. So the general overview for fantasy football is that it's a game built on top of a game. So we're all aware of the NFL and, professional football. So whether you support your hometown team or you just know of a player or two, that's what we basically play off of. Think of it kind of like a cell phone, right? So we have our phone, but then we have apps that are built into the phone as well. It's kind of 2 different layers to technology in a way. And that's what we do for fantasy football. We are a game built on top or built into another game. It's played weekly with a group of people and that group of people remains consistent throughout the entire NFL season. And basically the point of fantasy football is that it gives regular people like us the opportunity to build and manage our own team as if we were running a franchise. A lot of people dream and a lot of people go to school for sports or business management, and they're like, I would love to be in the front office or managing an NFL team, or I would love to own a professional sports team. But let's be honest, only about 1.5% of people ever get the chance to do that, and that number is actually less than what I just said. So this is our way to kind of live out our dream throughout this fictional game, but it's so much more than that. And it's really just a way to take your fandom to the next level, because while playing fantasy football, you get to explore players from every single team, not just the 1 or 2 teams that you're familiar with. So basically what fantasy football allows you to do is you get a broader scope of the league as a whole, and therefore it really gets to test your knowledge of the sport. How well do you know players who play on the other side of the country or in a different time zone than your team? But then even just a step further, instead of testing your knowledge, it also gets to grow your knowledge as well. You get to become so much more aware of the players and the league as a whole rather than just your little city or team that you root for. So that's a very, very quick overview, and just that's very, very simple and very cut and dry. Hopefully I explained that well enough. Once again, this video is just going to be, we're going to keep it simple, right? The KISS. What do they call it? The KISS method in math or whatever? That's what we're trying to do. Keep it simple, stupid. That's what it is. That's really just how this whole series is going to go, just being able to welcome people to this sport, to this game. Is it a sport? I consider it a sport, but we'll get into that much later. So how does fantasy football work? So it starts off with a league, and any great fantasy football player has a league or two. So leagues are formed between either family, friends, coworkers, or random people that maybe you met online. It's really cool in that way. You can just really connect with anybody, like social media, for fantasy football. And in these leagues, you then are, in the leagues, you then compete against the other people in the league. So it's not just you're playing against yourself. It's not like golf where you are only trying to. It's not like golf in the sense of where it's an independent sport. No. You are playing in matchups and you are playing against opponents. But before we get there, you have to have a draft, and the draft is how you determine which players you have on your team, on your roster. And it's very important to note that no team can hold the same player. So if I have a player, Johnny cannot take that same player. Once I get that player, he is mine until I decide to either let him go or trade him. And within that, we call that the draft. Once the draft is done, we then get into the regular season. And the regular season is built upon the NFL season. So in the NFL, if you are familiar, if you're not, this is just an easy explanation. They play in terms of what they call weeks. They only play 17 times a year, or 16 times a year, but they are 17 weeks in the season. And that's what we play off of. That's what the NFL plays off of. So for example, you would have one opponent for week 1. You would then have a different opponent for week 2, a third opponent for week 3, and so on and so forth. Depending on the size of your league, you may face certain opponents once or twice, or you may, and that all really just depends on league format. And throughout that, just like any other competition, you then accumulate wins and losses, ultimately setting up for a playoff and championship format later on in the year. So it's pretty much like any other sports league when you really break it down to brass tacks. There is nothing real complicated about fantasy football in that way. If you played sports growing up, even if you just know even if you just understand the basics of what a sports tournament is, that's fantasy football in a nutshell. Just a little bit different because we aren't the ones actually playing the sport. We are instead almost gambling in a way on other people playing the sport. And lastly, this is my final point. Once again, this video is just going to be super short and a nice little quick explanation for what the basics of fantasy football are. And then we're going to continue this later on all throughout the week. We're going to just finish this series and knock it out. But then finally, how do you win? How do you lose? What happens here? So this is when scoring comes into effect. And this is where I believe that anybody can get into fantasy football without actually knowing the NFL, knowing players, or things like that. This is where your sports knowledge, you don't have to have a whole lot of it, admittedly. Now, if you want to win, you're probably going to need some. But just to get into fantasy football, you don't need a whole lot of pre-existing knowledge. Fantasy football, at the end of the day, is a game of math, statistics, and probability. So if you are comfortable with any of those, then you can play fantasy football. And honestly, if you want to break it down even further, if you can do third grade multiplication and addition, you can play fantasy football. It really is that easy. If you know what 30 divided by 3 is, why did my camera just turn off? Oh no. I apologize about that, but as I was saying, if you can do third grade multiplication, addition, and division, you can play fantasy football. If you know that 30 divided by 10 equals 3, you can play fantasy football. If you know that 100 divided by 25 equals 4, you can play fantasy football. It's really just a game of math, and when you break it down like that, this game becomes a lot less scary. it can be very overwhelming because you're trying to think of, I need to focus on learning these players and these teams, and I have to watch all these games. No, you really don't. Us diehards, obviously, we're going to do that because we fucking love this thing. But if you are just looking for an entry point into fantasy football, understand that it's truly not that complicated. On the surface, it can be very detailed, and it looks like this depth pool of stats and research and players, and oh my god, what am I going to do? But in its basic form, fantasy football is a game of math and statistics. So hopefully that does put your mind at ease, and that you aren't entering this, I don't know, that you aren't entering this forest of so many different factors, and oh my god, I have to learn so much. So hopefully that just eases you overall. But I think that's really it for what I wanted to talk about today. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about the draft. Actually, we're doing research tomorrow. I think we're doing research tomorrow, followed by the draft, free agency, and then matchups and scoring, I think it is. Regardless, though, that's all I got for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, if this video helped you out in any way, if you play fantasy football and you want someone to understand what you're actually doing, be sure to send them this video. But anyways, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. We're doing this thing 2 times a day, Monday through Friday. We're usually doing a team preview in the early morning and then a video like this in the afternoon. So be sure to stick around for that. Follow me on all social media at FFVulture. Check out the website, ffvulture.com. And be sure to text me, where we go, 330-302-1554. Other than that, I'm out. Later. Remember, final tip, final thing here. People come and go, but fantasy championships are forever. Later.